in the arms of an angel. Jenny flew into her granny's arms. "Oh, good grief!" exclaimed the old woman. "That's quite a hug." "I missed you," said Jenny. She kissed her granny's soft, wrinkly face. "It's nice to be missed," replied the old woman. Jenny didn't let go. Her granny was warm and smelt of lily of the valley. Jenny loved that scent. Her mother didn't wear perfume. If ever she smelt it on another person, it always reminded her of her bubbly old grandmother. She laid her head on her shoulder and kept very still. She stared at the woman in the bed opposite. She looked at the white hair, the tired features, the oxygen tube in her nose. She watched the old woman's chest slowly rise and fall. She was half expecting it to cease. She clutched her granny tighter. "What's bothering you?" asked her granny gently. "That thing we were talking about the last time. About where you go after—" "Ah, that thing." She stroked her granddaughter on the back. "I shouldn't worry about it. We all go through that stage." Jenny continued to lie there. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Jenny nodded. "Very well, then. It's a story about me, about something that happened to me when I was your age. But first, a quick question. Do you know how the Blitz was?" Jenny nodded again. "We learned about that last term. Mrs. Benchley showed us a video about it. You were 10 when the Blitz started, weren't you?" "That's right. A long time ago now. We lived in London at the time. My father, your great-grandfather, was off fighting the Germans, and my mother worked in a munitions factory, along with lots of other women whose husbands had gone off to war. Where we lived was in an area of London called Angel Islington, which had an old underground tube station that was no longer in use. They'd closed it down because it wasn't needed. But it made a perfect air raid shelter, and every time those sirens went off, many people from that area were ushered down to the platforms where hot soup and bunk beds were waiting for them. It was a bit like a social gathering in a way, with all your neighbours and friends. Everybody was going through the same thing, you see. We all understood how each individual felt, and we were there for each other under very difficult circumstances. The company of other people can be very comforting in times of need. I had been down there a few times, but it's the last time I was ever down there that I want to tell you about. You see, something happened to me that night that I've never told anybody about since. I've simply kept it to myself, my little secret. I'm sure you have some secrets that you don't want to share with anybody." Jenny nodded. "Well, I've managed to keep this a secret for 75 years, and I feel like sharing it with you now." Before she continued, the old lady planted a kiss on the little girl's head. I believe it was about 10 o'clock when the sirens went off. I remember I couldn't sleep that night, so I had crawled under the bed to play with my rag doll Isabel. For some reason, being under the bed rather than on it made me feel just that little bit safer. I hated those sirens, the way they pierced the silence with their dreadful wailing. It was a terrifying noise, and one that stayed with me ever since. When I heard them that night, they sent a shrill through my body. A few moments later, I heard my mother on the stairs. I scurried out from under the bed, dragging Isabel with me. My little sister Ellie was still asleep, and I went over and shook her awake. My mother came into the room and told us to hurry, but we both knew the routine now. She carried my sister downstairs and opened the front door. It was a cold night, so I put my coat on over my dressing gown. I could see our neighbours, the Soderbergs. They were coming out of their house. Across the road, doors were opening and people were making their way down the street towards the old station, carrying with them whatever provisions I thought they might need. Just in front of the station, towering above it, it seemed, was the statue of an angel, with his arms spread wide. The station was called the Angel. Every time we'd gone down there, my mother would look up into that statue's face, and holding us both by the hand, she would say, "It's all right, girls. We're in the arms of an angel. Nothing can harm us." And that always gave me comfort. Once inside, everybody headed through the now deserted foyer with its abandoned ticket office and filed down the long, steep stairs to the platform where the bunk beds waited for them. There was a lot of adrenaline and bustle during these moments, and until everybody had settled, it was always an agitated period. Babies crying, children clinging to their parents, people pushing through one another to reach a spare bunk. That night my mother found us a bunk close to the stairs. She put my sister in it and tucked her up in the sleeping bag provided. I seem to remember she was fairly soon asleep again. I didn't want to try and sleep. I never could down there. There was always too much activity. Besides, by the time we got down there, any notion of sleep would abandon me. I was always too worried about what was going on upstairs. That night the explosion started pretty soon. Each rumble and bang sent an emotional shockwave through everybody. You could tell the entire place was holding its breath. The explosions went on for an hour. When the hour was up, there was a lull in the storm, but we knew it wasn't over. The soup came out then, and people began to queue for that, including my mother. Now I knew that I wasn't supposed to wander off. I certainly knew I wasn't allowed upstairs until it was confirmed that the threat had passed. Nobody was allowed upstairs. But rules are made to be broken, and that night I was feeling particularly adventurous. I waited until no one was looking, and holding tight to Isabel, crept up the long, steep stairs towards the foyer. When I got there, I crouched at the top and peered through the glass doors ahead of me. The street was empty, but I could see the telltale glow in the sky. I remember my heart was pounding, so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I was now out of the safe zone and in harm's way. I saw the plinth on which the angel stood, and just the bottom of its robe, the bare feet protruding from under it. I'm in the arms of an angel, I told myself. I must have spoken it aloud, because a voice answered me then, a man's voice. Then nothing can harm you, he said. I stood up. The gentleman who had spoken was leaning against the ticket booth. I remember thinking that the poor man must have had come from a party or smart dinner, because he was dressed in an immaculate white suit with a white hat on his head. Even his shoes were white. He looked like a performer, like one of those people who played the piano in a bar. At the time that I saw him, he was in the process of lighting a pipe, which, amazing as it may seem, was white. The end of it began to glow, and a plume of fragrant smoke rose up into the air. "You're very brave to come up here on your own," he said, extinguishing the match. "So are you," I replied. He smiled and removed the pipe from his mouth. "What's your name?" he asked. "What's yours?" I replied in a cheeky tone. "Just call me Bernard," he said, replacing the pipe in his mouth and folding his arms in a casual pose. I grinned. "And you can call me Katie," I said. I didn't like the name Carol much when I was that age, and unless it was really necessary, I would always tell people I was called Katie, which I much preferred. The gentleman nodded. "Well, good evening to you, Katie. I imagine it must be well past your bedtime by now." I shrugged. "So what if it is?" I said. "So what indeed? You're here now, and here is not terribly conducive to sleeping." He certainly had an odd way of speaking, this gentleman, very proper and correct, as though he were a man of both means and education. I studied him closely, studied his face and his eyes. They were almost feminine, beautiful, perfect-looking features. All in all, a very handsome man. "I couldn't sleep anyway," I said. "I was playing with Isabel when the sirens went off." I held up my rag doll for him to see. He came towards me now and stretched out a hand. "May I?" he asked. I handed Isabel to him. Gently he turned her over in his hands, as though expecting her ragged state. But there was no mockery in what he was doing. He was enjoying her simplicity, enjoying the idea of complete innocence in a child's toy. He knew she gave me great pleasure, and he liked that. Again I found myself inspecting him in return. His fingers were long and slender, with well-manicured nails. "What were you doing when you heard their sirens?" I asked. Still looking at the rag doll, he answered, "I was playing music." "I thought so," I said. "You look like a performer. What do you play? The piano?" "I play the harp," he replied. "My father used to play it. He taught me when I was a boy." "You must be very good." "I am," he replied. I coughed suddenly. His brow wrinkled. "Is the pipe bothering you?" I shook my head. "Not at all. In fact, I rather like the smell." He smiled. "It's aromatic, that's why." I sighed and leaned against the top of the steps. I didn't notice that everything had gone silent. I wasn't afraid anymore. At that moment there was just myself and this gentleman. "I'm bored," I said suddenly. "Let's go and explore." "Won't somebody be worrying about where you got to?" I shrugged. "We don't have to go too far," I said. "And anyway, I'm with you. You're an adult, so I'll be safe, won't I?" "Of course you will." We began to wander through the foyer with its white tiled walls that had begun to collect dust, and past the old ticket booth with its grimy windows. We were heading towards another set of steps that led to the adjacent platform. "Let's go down here," he said, walking beside me at an equally relaxed pace. "My father and I used to travel in this line," he said, as we descended. "I always found it exciting. I loved all the bustle and hustle. Now there's nothing." The stairs went down into the darkness. It felt suddenly that we were walking into the mouth of some foreboding place. I stopped. "What's the matter?" asked Bernard. "I'm scared. I want to go back." "There's nothing to be afraid of, remember? You're in the arms of an angel. Nothing can harm you." I looked up at him. He looked down at me. His face was in shadow, but I could tell he was smiling. "Okay," I said. We carried on down. "Where do angels come from, anyway?" I asked. "From heaven," he replied. His face glowed for a moment as the tobacco flared up and then was dark again. "I know that. I'm not stupid. It's just that, well, what is heaven?" He took the pipe from his mouth. "That's a very serious question for a very young girl. Wouldn't you rather know about ponies or dolls' houses?" "I'm 10, I said. "That's not young. Besides, I'm not interested in ponies or dolls' houses, so there's no point in telling me about them, is there? I think you're just behaving like a typical adult and trying to avoid answering a question that you think I won't understand the answer to." He stopped then and stared down at me for a moment. "All right," he said. "Heaven is a place for all souls that have escaped the physical bonds of earth. It is a place of immense beauty that no human eye has ever seen or ever will, except when they die." He paused a beat. "Does that answer your question satisfactorily?" I churned his answer over in my head for a moment and then frowned. "Not really." We started walking again. "That's because until we die there is no true answer to that question. Human beings will always wonder about it. They'll go to the border between life and death and report incredible encounters with heavenly beings or past relatives. Sometimes people will even appear to die and then come back to life with what they think are the answers." "And are they?" I asked. "Well, that's a decision only they can make. If they believe they are, then they are. You see, it's belief that humans need, the belief that there is something out there. The other word for it is faith. My mother talks about faith. She says she has faith in God. Do you have faith in God?" "Yes," he said, "very much so." "Does God live in heaven?" I asked him. "He does. Very comfortably, in fact." He smiled. "And is he in charge?" "In a way." In the next moment, we had reached the bottom. Everything was pitch black. Once again I stopped. I clutched at Bernard's hand for a bit of comfort. His hand seemed very warm as it encapsulated mine. At that moment the lights all along the platform flickered on. I blinked. "How did that happen?" I asked. "It must be magic," he said. "Or it could be these switches here." I saw the metal panel on the wall to his left. He winked at me. I let go of his hand now and skipped along the platform, Isabel flopping about with every hop. The sound of my feet reverberated around the walls. I played with the echo, shouting at it, and hearing it shout back at me. I went to the edge of the platform and leaned forward to peer into the tunnel. "Boo!" I shouted. The platform was littered with pieces of scaffolding and workmen's tools. On one of the benches lay an electric lantern. Bernard pointed to it. "How would you like a real adventure?" he said. We walked into the blackness of the abandoned tunnel, me holding the lantern aloft to illuminate our way. "It's amazing," I said. "To think that trains used to rush along here. Imagine one came along here now." My voice was filled with excitement. Bernard laughed. "Adventures are fun things," he said, "but they can also be scary. Life is the scariest adventure there is." I nodded slowly. "My mother is often scared," I said. She is scared that my father will not return from the war. I looked up at him. Why are there wars? I asked. It's a good question. Wars are created by man, Katie. Man has it in him to fight, to do terrible things, but he also has it in him to do beautiful things. Your father believes that Hitler is wrong. He does not agree with his views. He is being very brave, and that is his adventure. Why can't his be fun, like this one? I asked. There are many different adventures, an answer to that question. You see, you learn many things on your adventures. The harder the adventure, the more you learn. Why? That's just the way of it, said Bernard. He sucked on his pipe. He held up the lantern and shone it around me. The tunnel walls were wet and slimy. Water dripped from the ceiling onto the track ahead of us. What does it feel like to die? I asked suddenly. I believe it is very pleasant. Apparently there is a tunnel, not a dank, dark tunnel like this one, but a beautiful, bright, warm tunnel which leads to heaven. There you will find the people that went before you, your friends, loved ones, even your pets. Do you have pets? We have a cat called Molly. She's all black, except her left paw, which is white. Well, when you die, she'll be waiting there to greet you with her white paw. He smiled. I did not. I could not cope suddenly with this situation, and I burst into tears. I worry about my daddy, I sobbed. Mother worries about him all the time. I hear her crying in her room at night, and I want to go and comfort her, but I don't. I worry about the Germans invading us, about what's going to happen if they do. What will happen to me and my little sister? I'm so scared, Bernard. He squatted down and put his arms around me. He brushed the tears away with his thumb. He was so gentle with me. But you don't need to be scared, remember? Because you're in the arms of an angel. That's just something my mother says to make us feel safe. She's just talking about the statue outside. It's not a real angel. Ah, but there are real angels, Katie. Lots of them. And they're around us all the time, protecting us, keeping us safe from danger. The angels are God's helpers. If someone is in danger when it isn't their time, he will send one of his angels to save that person. And can you see these angels? I asked. He smiled. Sometimes, when they dress up like humans. Why do so many soldiers die? I asked. Don't the angels save them? That's a very difficult one to answer, Katie. But I can promise you that Germany will not win this war. They will not occupy this country, and they will not kill your father. How do you know? I asked. Trust me, he said. Come on. I bet there's an abandoned carriage up ahead. Let's go and find it, shall we? We carried on walking along the tunnel a little way. Why don't we play hide and seek? He suggested. I smiled and nodded. I'll hide first. You count. It must have been about this time that my mother realized I was nowhere among the crowd. She reported this to one of the workers. Leaving my sister asleep in her bunk, the two of them set off to find me. As I closed my eyes, I heard Bernard tiptoe away across the tracks. They were heading further down the tunnel. 19, 20, coming, will you not? I opened my eyes again, and immediately headed in the direction I thought he had gone. It must have been a few minutes later when I stopped. Bernard? My voice echoed. Bernard, where are you? He didn't answer. I give up, I shouted again. You win. Still no answer. Bernard? Apart from the echo, the tunnel was silent. My heart started a thud. I gripped Isabel tighter. Why wasn't he answering me? And then a voice did answer me, but it wasn't Bernard's. Carol? I spun round. Mum, I'm down here, I shouted. I saw a light from another lantern as my mother and a gentleman approached. What in heaven's name are you doing in here? She demanded angrily. I lowered my head. I came down here with... You come down with me right now, young lady. I am very angry. She took hold of my arm and started pulling me back down the tunnel. I glanced back behind me, but I still couldn't see Bernard. Honestly, Carol, what if something had happened to you down here? It was at that moment that the sound of a huge explosion thundered down the tunnel ahead of us. The ground beneath my feet shook. My mother screamed. Oh my God! She shouted. She clasped a hand over her mouth. The station! Shouted her companion. It must have been hit. No! Shrieked my mother. She started running forward, but the man grabbed hold of her. You can't go back that way. It's not safe. My baby! She screamed. There's nothing you can do, shouted the man. The only way of getting out and getting help is by carrying on along this tunnel. The next station on this line is only half a mile or so. It's our best option. But my baby! She screamed again. Trust me. You can't go back there. But we can go on and summon help. Very reluctantly, my mother let herself be led in the opposite direction from where she wanted to go so desperately. She clutched me to her side and sobbed. God help us, she said. God help us. My little sister, I thought. Gone. All those people. Why? They were supposed to be safe down here. And where was Bernard? Had I been mistaken in thinking that he'd gone forward instead of back? Back towards death? A tear rolled down my cheek at the thought of it. I wondered how it had been for him. Was it a bright tunnel? And what about the others? Where were they now? Heading towards their salvation, most probably, their spent carcasses left behind in the rubble. I thought about my father coming home from the front to learn that his youngest daughter had perished in the Blitz. It took us only 20 minutes to come out at the next station. We heard the hubbub of people before we saw them, and the lights shining. Both my mother and the gentleman started running now. They were surprised to see us. 3 figures emerging out of a darkened tunnel. Our desperate faces quickly told them of the horror of the next station. We were helped up onto the platform. My mother was hysterical. The gentleman explained the situation to a group of volunteer aid workers. One of them he knew, and action was immediately taken. 15 minutes later we were on board an emergency vehicle that raced through the deserted streets on the tail of a fire truck. We had been advised to stay in the other station, but my mother was having none of it. The bombs were still falling. We could see the flashes in the sky, and there was smoke and dust everywhere. The angel still stood, with his arms outstretched, staring down on a pile of smouldering rubble. I remember thinking that it was a miracle the statue had not been completely destroyed. My mother took one look at the mess and started to scream again. My baby's in there! My baby's in there! The fire truck screeched to a halt outside, and the group of volunteer firemen jumped down to survey the damage and decide on the next course of action. Somewhere under there were the stairs to the platform where my sister had been peacefully sleeping. If there were any survivors, they had to be got to quickly. Another fire truck could be heard in the distance, and a few moments later it appeared. The firemen and everyone else on the scene set to work to clear away the rubble. The sense of urgency was palpable. But it became apparent fairly soon what had actually happened. It was explained to my mother by one of the firemen. It's just the building that's been flattened by the shockwave. If a bomb had actually landed here, there would be a crater, and we would have no survivors. If everyone was down on this platform, I doubt there's any fatalities. I saw my mother's face change from one of fear to one of hope. She hugged the man. Just get my daughter out of there, she said. It took an hour to clear an entrance big enough to get access to the stairs. A group of 6 firemen went down into the darkness with torches. Almost immediately, shouts rose up from below, but they weren't made by the firemen. A minute later, a stream of people staggered out of the rubble. A chorus of cheers and clapping arose from the rescue party, and aid workers rushed in to help the survivors. My mother rushed forward too, but she was urged to keep back to give some people space. Suddenly, though, she saw our neighbour, Mr. Söderberg, and rushed forward again. This time nobody stopped her. Mr. Söderberg! She shouted. He turned and saw her. My daughter Ellie! Where is she? Is she okay? Before he could answer, Mrs. Söderberg emerged, carrying my little sister in her arms. My mother ran to her. I can't describe to you what it was like to see my baby sister, safe and well, and still half asleep. But there was somebody else I wanted to see safe and well. I glanced around me for a man in a white suit and hat, who I felt sure would stand out in the crowd. I didn't see him. He must still be down there, I thought. I watched the stream of survivors streaming out of the hole, eagerly awaiting a glimpse of my gentleman. I watched as the stream turned to a trickle, with still no sign of him. That's the last of them, somebody shouted. My brow furrowed, and then my heart began pounding. I ran forward. There's still somebody down there, I screamed. The fireman who'd shouted shook his head. No, miss, it's all right, everyone's up now. But they're not, I cried. There's a man in white. His name's Bernard. The fireman shook his head again. I've been down there. I assure you that everybody is accounted for. But that can't be, I said, tears beginning to fill my eyes again. He's down there. The fireman now looked alarmed. He called to one of his colleagues. "We might have missed somebody. Either that or we've got a sort of fatality. This girl insists there's a man down here, Bernard." He turned to one mate again. "Do you know what his second name is, miss?" I shook my head, the tears flowing now. "We'll ask around, see if anyone else knows this Bernard. You say he was dressed in white?" They asked, but nobody knew him. I held on to my mother and cried and cried. "He was there," I sobbed. "He took me down to the platform. We played hide and seek." It was at that moment that one of the firemen approached us. "Mrs. Clark, is it?" he asked. My mother nodded. "Well, I thought I would just take the opportunity to tell you that I think you might just have saved these people's lives. I've just been talking to some of the men over there. They say the tunnel on the platform everybody was on had been blocked up. They were in the process of blocking off the other one too." My mother stared at him. "I don't know what you were doing down on that platform, but you were damn lucky. Any later and nobody would have been able to raise the alarm. They might well have suffocated down there." As the fireman walked away, my mother squeezed my hand tight. "It's a miracle," she said, half to herself. She turned her head towards the statue. "Saved by an angel, my sweet." She looked down at me and smiled. I tried to smile back, but I was still tearful. Where was Bernard? Had he somehow got out? How could a man dressed all in white go unnoticed? I had a horrible feeling he had not made it back to the safety of the platform. Instead, he had been a moment too late, and when coming across into this deserted foyer where I had first seen him, he had been killed by the blast caused by a bomb that had landed in the adjacent street. The thought brought fresh tears to my eyes. My mother knelt down in front of me. "I'm so sorry about your friend," she said, and gave me a hug. "In a way, it was him that saved us. If he hadn't gone with you to that platform—" She kissed me. We heard another explosion. "Come on, let's go. We have to get back to the other station." As we passed the statue, my mother had Ellie in her arms, and me she held by the hand. We paused underneath it, and looking up, she said, "Thank you." The angel glowed a fiery red from the surrounding sky, flickering across its beautifully carved face. And then I saw it. I let out a little gasp and clutched my mother's hand more tightly. "What is it?" she asked. The... I couldn't get the words out. "Come on, darling. We need to move," she said. Jenny stared at her granny. Her eyes seemed distant. She stopped talking for a moment. "What did you see, Granny? What made you gasp?" "What made me gasp," continued the old woman, "was the fact that when I looked up at that angel's face, I saw Bernard." Jenny frowned. "What do you mean?" "He was the angel, Jenny. My gentleman in white. In that instant I had a moment of clarity. It all made sense. Bernard was an angel. He hadn't perished, just flown away. My mother was right. He did save us. It was just like Bernard had told me in the tunnel. They come to save people who are not ready to die." "Wait a minute," said Jenny, still confused. "How can a statue come to life?" "The statue didn't come to life. Bernard used the statue's face to tell me in no uncertain terms that that's what he was." "But how can he do that?" "Because he's an angel. I don't know what angels really look like. All I know is that he created an image of himself that I would feel comfortable with. Perhaps he existed only in my mind. I'm not sure. He seemed real enough to me. My point is, sweetheart, that death is not something to be afraid of. I learned that day that there are people beyond this physical world, whose job it is to take care of us, but that job doesn't necessarily stop when we die. I know Bernard is waiting for me. I've known it since that night." Jenny's eyes strayed to the flowers on the bedside table. A nurse walked by, pushing a trolley full of medicine. The ward was small and sunny. It looked out onto a shady garden. She liked it. It was a place of peace. When Carol's heart stopped beating at 3:30 the following morning, the ward was quiet. The card Jenny had left her grandmother stood open on the bedside cabinet with a personal message inside. It was the last thing Carol had read. Somebody else was now reading it. He was quite tall, immaculately dressed in a brilliant white suit, with a white hat to match. Smoke drifted from a pipe he held between his teeth. He smiled. "What a lovely granddaughter you have, Carol." The old lady nodded. The door to the garden stood open. Carol took Bernard's hand as they walked towards it. "I think it's past my bedtime," she said. "My dear Katie," said Bernard, "time doesn't matter anymore.